And then I ended up with this giant Pro Tools session of 6 hours of amazing performance of vocals and all these different instruments that they play. And now I have like a spine that I can build the rest of the score up from.
So I'm curious, how has 2021 looked for you so far?
I had actually a very busy 2020, which was very fortunate. And obviously the Pathless was kind of the driving force of that, but had some other things going on as well, and shipped a few other games in that time, and smaller kind of one-off projects. And then had a few things that were kind of simmering on low heat that are now at their boil and ready to come off the fire. And so just about finished with a new score, actually, that we recorded the orchestra for it in the first, it was like January 7th or something like that. And so in the final stages of getting that delivered, and that game's not even announced yet, but that'll be out in the world before too long. And then there's other things that stretch, in some cases, probably 3 to 4 years down the road before they're ever going to be anything, how it often goes. But very lucky, it's always nice to have things, to be simultaneously working on things where, something is short-term, very focused, something is kind of low burn, like not having to work on it every day yet. And then other things that are so far off that it's just kind of milling around in the subconscious, waiting to be needed up front. And I like having a blend of those kinds of timelines all, on top of each other.
I've known that you've kind of wanted to grow your own YouTube channel as well on the side. So why have you decided to pursue creating videos on YouTube?
My assistant Dallas, who is a major part of helping me make these videos, he's doing all the video editing and graphics work, and my job is to make the content. His job is to make it something that can actually be seen by people. And I think he tallied that we released 70 videos or nearly that in 2020. It's crazy. And I've always enjoyed crafting hopefully interesting behind the scenes content. A lot of people ask a lot of questions, and when you're on Twitter enough, and at some point you realize that there's kind of a short list of questions that everyone asks over and over and over. So it might just be more efficient to answer it in a hopefully interesting and visually compelling way, and just say, hey, rather than sit here typing an answer, because I don't want to be a jerk and just ignore them, I can actually answer it better by just sending them a link to YouTube and saying, hey, check this out. And it lets me also obviously, show some of the adventures that we have behind the scenes on some of these projects, where, get to do all kinds of cool collaborations with interesting musicians or record in unique locations and all that kind of stuff. And I love that, and being able to shine a light on those various partnerships. And then I also just kind of enjoy the video essay concept. I enjoy, I've only released a couple of them so far, but on my channel, there's a couple of videos under this banner of Magic Moments where I kind of analyze some scores that I like. One is from the movie Milena with music by Ennio Morricone, and the other one is my interpretation of Gustavo Santaolla's music from The Last of Us Parts 1 and 2. And I have a list of 50 other scores that I want to do essays on, where there's very specific moments. It's usually one single cue that I say, that cue made me a better composer, and I want to do a 10-minute video talking about why. So just, I don't know. It's a fun way to share. I enjoy being a nerd and geeking out about this stuff. And it's like a format that you put in a lot of work, but then it can just live there, and hopefully over time, more and more people find it.
Cool. And so now on the score for the Pathless, do you remember what the first moment or musical motif that kicked the soundtrack off?
Well, my collaborations with Matt Nava, Abzu before it, and really Journey, you could say before that. He was technically the art director of Journey, but we did start together there. All of those have begun with just, let's craft a theme. Let's figure out a way to create a musical signature or something, some kind of flag that the rest can kind of be measured against. So if I write a piece of music and it feels like it's from a different score than the theme, then it probably means that this new piece is not right, assuming that we agree on the theme. And so Abzu started that way, and Pathless was no different. He said, what are you imagining? He showed me concept art. We talked about the game, walked through kind of the vision for it. There was still a lot that was unknown, but he knew the basics. And which is how most of the time, how these things start. You don't know everything, obviously. You make a lot of discoveries while you make the game. And so I played around and came up with that very simple, theme. And the idea was a melody that kind of feels like a folk melody. It sort of feels like something that folk singers might sing around a campfire, and has a very simple quality to it, but yet hopefully is very recognizable non-vocally. And because I just, something about the way that the world was constructed, I found myself immediately picturing a kind of collision of different cultures' folk sounds. And I also knew that Mongolian falconry was a major inspiration for the character design. So I found myself immediately thinking about throat singing, because it just is a natural association. It's not a Mongolian game, but I'm always looking for something I've never done. And as soon as I latched on to throat singing, I said, well, I've never done that. That's going to be my obsession for this score. And he liked it. And so, off we went. And I wrote that theme, and it basically never changed. Sometimes that happens, but in the case of both Abzu and the Pathless, the theme, including how I arranged it, basically never changed from day one to the end, which was in both cases more than 3 years later.
Yeah, there must have been some research you probably did during the Pathless.
Well, it depends on what you mean. I'm kind of in a perpetual state of research. Like every single day I'm listening to new music, and I'm reading about instruments, and I find it joyous. Like, as a hobby, basically. I just love learning about new things. Plus, a lot of the musicians I work with are these ultra talented multi-instrumentalists who every time they go buy something new, they send me an email to say, hey, I just bought this in case you ever want to write for it. And so then I go down this rabbit hole of researching that instrument whenever I get that email. So in some cases, it's an instrument I've never used before, but it's something I've been trying to find an excuse to use for the last 5 years or whatnot. In the case of the Tuvan throat singing, I was connected to the Alash ensemble pretty early. And so I definitely did some explicit research, not just on them and how they operate and their history as a group. They're almost like a band, but also specifically within the traditions of Tuvan throat singing, what makes it different from Mongolian throat singing and there's a few other cultures that have their own kind of version of throat singing. I had dabbled a little bit in throat singing once before, a long time ago in the Inuit tradition, but that's a really different beast. And I hadn't really gotten deep into it. I just kind of had a glancing blow. So this was one where I really, I also got on the phone with their manager, who's also their translator. And I said, give me a primer on how best to go about learning this, so I'm not flying blind. And he was wonderful. We had great long conversations, and so that was the biggest area of blindness for me going in, was just learning how that really works, what their different instruments are capable of, how they use them, how they work together as a group, where the lines of improvisation versus bespoke composition fall, and then just the innumerable techniques that they use in throat singing. There's like a whole orchestra's worth of colors that they bring to the table, and they all have names, and they all have names that are exactly what you would expect from a folk tradition, where it's like, this kind of singing is supposed to imitate, the sound of the wind. This is the sound of thunder. This is the hooves of a camel on the plains. Like they have very folk-like descriptions that they associate these various techniques with. And it was wonderful to get in and really, try to know, I'm not a Tuvan musician. It's not like I'm an expert, but I wanted more than a superficial understanding.
So did you write out those solo parts for the instruments like the nickel harpa or Tuvan?
Oh, well, nickel harpa, absolutely, yes. Every one of those parts is 100% notated. Nickel harpa is a cousin of like violin or viol da gamba or any number of other stringed instruments, so you would write for it very similarly to how you write for it, although it has different things that it struggles with and different things that are very easy for it. And so you learn, I would make adjustments as I did sessions with the performer in Morgan. And he would say, just so you know, this kind of figure is actually really hard to do. And he would show me, he'd be standing right behind me and say, let me show you how I have to finger that. And I would see like, oh, that's a very awkward thing to finger. But if I just made this slight adjustment, it just suddenly now it was all very easy for him. So I would study those distinctions, which is no different than writing for any other instrument. It's the same with violin, viola, French horn, trumpet, whatever. You learn the realities of what the musician is dealing with in order to write into things that will make them play naturally, so that they can just focus on playing beautifully and expressively and not just acrobatically navigating the technical awkwardness of it. In the case of the Alash Ensemble, I did initially write out parts. We did a session in Manhattan, and I didn't really like any of it. It was all prototype music. There are a few bits from that recording that made it into the final game, but very, very little, because I could tell immediately that this was a bad idea, that I was trying to make them be musicians that they're not. They're not orchestral musicians. They're not the kind of musicians that sit down and read a chart. They can read music. It's not their strength, but it's in their wheelhouse if they need it. And because they also do collaborations with like classical chamber ensembles and other kinds of groups outside of their own tradition, like cultural exchange type events, like probably jazz musicians, all kinds of interesting crossovers. So they can roll with it. They can gel with whomever, but it was obvious that was not the way to work with them. So I thought about it for a few months after that and reflected and then I came to them with a proposal and said, what if we just jam together? There's no written parts of any kind. So I gave myself about 7 or 8 months. I was about halfway through the score. And then I basically threw out all the music I had been writing, other than a few things here and there, because I realized I needed to start from a foundation of the Alash Ensemble, and that everything had to come from a place of improvisation, because that's really where they shine. They love to react to each other like jazz musicians. And so we worked it out. We booked a studio in Washington, D.C. They were on tour and they were passing through D.C. So I found a studio. Actually, they had recorded in this place before, coincidentally, so they just recommended a studio. I flew out to D.C. and I met them there. And we set it up where I put a piano in the middle of the room that was like an electric piano that they could hear in their headphones, but which was not being recorded in the room. And so we could all play together, but the mics were only recording them. And then we just jammed for 6 hours, where I literally and I knew I had already mapped out the whole score. So I knew all these kinds of things that I wanted to do. I knew a bunch of different tempos that I wanted to make sure to explore, and a bunch of different harmonic realms, we could say, not really keys, but kind of. And so then I would just say, okay, this next part, let's just try this. And we would just play, and we would just jam for like 30 minutes. And then I go, okay, cool, let's move on to this other. And I had a little list, but it was mostly just free form. We would play without stopping. We'd play the whole day. I mean, we would pause for like a minute and then play for 40 minutes and then pause for another minute. We took a break for lunch at one point, but that was it. It was just jamming. And then I ended up with this giant Pro Tools session of 6 hours of an amazing performance of vocals and all these different instruments that they play, and very well recorded by Bob, the engineer there. And then I was like, okay, now I have like a spine that I can build the rest of the score up from. And so I basically kind of started the whole score over again. And that was, so yeah, nothing notated at all.
So in your experience, how do you figure in looping the music or integration into the game?
So that's a tough one to answer generally, because every cue is different. Literally every single individual piece of music has a different set of rules based on how it functions within the gameplay. This is one of those things that I spend an enormous amount of time trying to figure out to make sure that it really is organic to the gameplay. So in the case of the Pathless, it was probably a solid year and a half of basically prototyping different interactive systems, putting it in the game, playing it, having the team play it, and coming back and going, okay, yeah, that's not going to work because of X, that's not going to work because of Y, let's try something different, and throwing it completely out and starting again, where it's not even really about the notes, it's just about how does it behave And of course, that's a moving target because the game itself is a moving target. They were changing things, adding things. At one point there was a whole sort of separate sub-mechanic involving hunting animals where you would chase them down and you shoot them with your arrow and like stun them, and then you would kind of pray and uncurse them, and then they would be happy and run around. And they completely cut that entire feature out of the game. Now the animals just kind of wander and they'll run away from you if you get too close to them before a plateau is cleansed. But there used to be a whole other thing there. So we had a whole musical system around this notion of hunting that's just gone. And so there was probably a year and a half of not really worrying about the composition so much as what is the integration plan or the scheme by which we are implementing. And so what we ended up with is a system. It's pretty complicated because it's an open world game. And so at any given time, the music is measuring a handful of variables, namely, where you are in the world. There are a few physical landmarks that are dictating what you're hearing in the music. How close you are to certain things is going to change certain instruments. But then also we're measuring your overall progress through the story, which is completely unconnected with where you are in the world. It's just how many of these bosses have you tackled? And if you've tackled none, you're early. If you've tackled a bunch, you're probably late. And so using that as our metric, the music actually is evolving in a narrative beats kind of way. And it's having to add those two together such that you can play through the game and have a pretty wildly different musical experience if you make some substantially different choices. Now, ironically, by the time the game shipped, they had designed the plateau layout such that probably most players go through the world the same way and beat the bosses in the same order, but you don't actually have to. And if you don't, the music will actually follow what you do. So I know you're asking specifically about loops, but it's one of those where loops are kind of inconsequential because that's zeroing in down to the genetic level. It's a far bigger picture. And funny enough, there's quite a few cues in this score that are not loops. They're just extremely long, continuous pieces of music that we're coming into and out of and remixing in real time. And they might feel like loops to the player, but it's actually just a single 7, 8, 9 minute cue that just plays straight through, which I've never really done before. Often loops are a big part of these scores, and there are certainly loops everywhere because all video game scores tend to be dominated by loops. But my whole goal is always, I don't ever want it to feel like it's looping. I don't like when video game music is so transparently mechanical. I don't like when you walk into a room and the music changes based on the fact that you walked into that room, because to me that's not storytelling, and the point of the music is to tell a story, and your physical location is not really the story. What matters is why I walked into this room. Well, if the reason I walked into the room, my motivation as a player and as a character was probably informed before I ever walked into it, so the music should have already been in that place before I walked in, which means that one of the big challenges we face is we often have to try to figure out what the player is doing before they do it. So I spent a lot of time working with the programmers saying, how much can we intuit about player behavior based on the kind of data that the system is drawing from how they're playing? And can I attach the music to those variables? And that's definitely the case with the Pathless.
What was the biggest mistake you made while working on the project that actually turned out to be a blessing for you?
I'm not sure. It's hard for me to differentiate between mistakes and just things I try that then I decide didn't work, and then I try something else. I go in expecting so much of that, and I throw out so many experiments that it would be very odd if everything just felt like it worked. But I don't consider that a mistake. I consider that part of the process.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an essential part of the process. I like experimenting and having room to fail. And so I'm not really sure. I don't know that I have a good answer to that. I think we, at the initial onset, we underestimated the size of the score. I ended up writing about 3 times more music than I expected to. But again, that's not a mistake. It's just, as someone who was hired to do a job, at some point I realized the job you hired me for is actually too narrow in scope from what the job demands. So I need to keep going, and ended up writing, what was supposed to be presumed to be around an hour of music ended up shipping with close to 3 hours of music. But I wouldn't call that a mistake. It's just how it goes sometimes. So yeah, sorry, I don't have a good answer for you on that one, but there wasn't anything. I have had projects before where I somehow made a massive mistake or something really didn't go right. I don't think that was ever the case here. I really loved every day of this project. The only thing that you could even kind of maybe call a mistake, but it's not. It's more actually the opposite. It's a way in which I got extremely lucky. But I wrote a score which incidentally I could never have produced differently than how I did. And if I had the recording session, we recorded a lot in London. And if I had needed to record even 1 month later, then COVID would have completely ruined my plans. And I got lucky that our sessions were right before the pandemic hit. And we just by chance had no idea that there was a pandemic coming. And some scores you can record by just having 1 million people all record at home, and you stitch together, and you can do without a big room and a lot of musicians all brought together. But that I definitely needed what we did here, and I would have had to rewrite a lot of the score if COVID had prevented that session. I quite literally couldn't have done the score I was writing and would have had to just throw out a lot and try to think of a new way to approach it, which would have been heartbreaking. So it's not that I made a mistake, but I wrote a very pandemic unfriendly score. And thank God I was able to execute it before the pandemic began for the most part. There are definitely all the cutscenes in the game when you finish a boss fight and there's this moment of the kind of inner spirit of the boss creature revealing itself, and they give you like an upgrade to your arrow or whatnot. Those cutscenes were not done during those initial sessions. They hadn't finished animating them. So I had to do a pickup session with string orchestra for all those like in August, much later. But by then the pandemic had come down enough that some orchestras were opening up again, but we had to have a smaller orchestra and everybody had to be seated kind of far apart from each other. So there are a few cues in the score that are smaller orchestra than other cues and technically recorded slightly differently to account for the pandemic. But I don't think anybody would ever be able to notice. So I got lucky that it was compatible with being able to at least do that.
Do you think your composing style has changed since you worked on this project?
Honestly, I think my style, I think we all change based on everything we do. If you are a writer and you write a novel, that means that you're injecting it and a very concentrated dose of writing into your life, and you will make discoveries, and there will be things that you find that you love and things that you find that you don't, and certain words that just appear along the way that you just find absolutely delicious, and others that you find yourself overly relying on and start actively avoiding. And that's all changing you as a writer by virtue of doing it. It's like being exposed to radiation that's just altering your DNA. You can't do the work unless you stand out in the sun and expose yourself to that radiation. So I think every score that I do, everything, score or otherwise, every piece of music I write just for myself or every concert I conduct, they all affect me in one way or another. It's kind of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle in action. You can't engage in the art without actively altering who you are as an artist. But that said, the Pathless, I think, influenced me even more than normal, because I've always, by and large, dismissed improvisation as a potential compositional tool. And this game is in so many ways built on the back of improvisation that I've realized I should explore that more. I should find a way to make that a part of the process in interesting ways to see where it takes me, even if it's not something where it would be obvious that that's the way to go. Like I would have utterly failed in my attempt to capture the Tuvan concept if I had tried to not improvise, but there are other things that benefit from improvising, even if they work fine normally. And so I think I probably will end up conscientiously looking for those places in the future. And I don't think I would have if it weren't for this project.
Mm. What's one habit you do every day that leads to your success?
Well, that's kind of a loaded question because it presumes that I feel successful. Most days I feel like I've got my work cut out for me today, because I don't consider success really based on yesterday. Success is more like what I hope to achieve today, or by the end of the day, I hope to have done X, Y, or Z, which means that success is more like a path you walk down. It's a horizon line you're always moving towards, hopefully. But that said, in other words, I hesitate to call myself successful. I mean, I know by certain measurements, like I'm not starving. I know that I'm not worried about my bills being paid this month. And for most of my career, that was not really the case. And so there's a definite shift emotionally when you realize, okay, I have a little bit of a foundation now. That's nice. That you could call that success, but I prefer to think in more abstract philosophical terms and artistic terms about the kind of idealism of artistry. But in terms of what I do every day, the one thing that I would say I do every day I wouldn't say it contributes to my success, but it contributes to who I am, and maybe who I am puts me on the right path. I don't know. It's kind of up to others to decide, I guess. But the one thing that I do every day is I consciously don't do the same thing every day. So I don't eat the same kind of food every day. I do sometimes dress kind of consistently because I keep this hoodie in my studio. So I tend to put it on when I arrive. It's not that I wear the same clothes below this every day, the same, but clothing is something I don't pay much attention to. So I do kind of go a little bit Steve Jobs-ish in that department, and just sort of don't think about it. But I don't drive. This is not my home. But this is like my studio is a commercial space that I rent, like an office, and I live a couple miles from here, so I don't drive the same route here 2 days in a row. I always take different routes, and sometimes I pick up food. I'll stop by a bagel place on the way in, or I'll come right in, or sometimes I go to the grocery store and buy some. Like this morning, I bought some yogurt from the grocery store, and I had that when I got in. Like I vary the basic ingredients of my day pretty substantially every day, because I don't ever want to write the same music every day. And I feel like if the whole day is kind of in a jumble, I don't see how I even could write the same music, because my starting position and just my mental state is so different. And there are also some days where I choose not to write music, where if unless I have a deadline that doesn't let me do that, I'll say, today I want to just listen to music, or today I just want to watch podcasts on YouTube, or play games, or watch movies. Or sometimes I will deliberately try to not work in the hopes that it feels somehow a little more fresh, a little bit more unfamiliar when I start again the next day. So yeah, I also, I didn't always have this piano in here. I try to make sure I spend some time each day playing, but some days then I actively avoid it for the same reason. I didn't used to it had been a long time since I actually just sat down to play, where I'm not writing, but I'm just playing. And it's been a while since I did that. So yeah, I think it's kind of a long-winded answer, but I really don't like to be guilty of repetition in my writing, and therefore in my lifestyle.
How does a composer like me, for example, like someone who's younger, go from writing purely for electronic or VST type of music into writing for real live orchestras?
Well, the first thing is to recognize that there is a long gradation between 100-piece orchestra and all VSTs, starting with a single musician, and maybe that single musician is you. Like, what do you play?
Like piano, guitar, bass?
Okay, perfect. So let's say you want to write a piece for strings and guitar. You can record yourself playing guitar, and now you have already graduated, as if that's an inevitable direction, but you've already left the realm of pure VST. You've got a mic there. All you need to do is just play guitar, and you don't even have to play guitar well. You can just choke off the strings and turn it into a rhythm instrument, and or drum on the body of it, and you're already integrating live recording and engineering with VSTs and synths and electronics and that kind of thing. Obviously, the next step is, you know, you have a friend, you know, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a roommate, just a fellow colleague, musician, someone you play in a band with. It doesn't take long to meet probably many dozens of people that play all kinds of instruments. I personally seek out people like that because I love hanging out with musicians, and I love having friends who play interesting instruments, and I love making music with people. So, you know, you get to be friends with somebody, and it doesn't even have to be based around a budget. A lot of people think, we don't have a recording budget for this. And I'm like, well, you know, if I have a history of, let's say I have a bassoon player friend where we love hanging and playing board games together every Sunday or whatever, fill in the blank. If I were to go to them and say, hey, I have a favor to ask, would you be willing to come in and just play some bassoon for me for 20 minutes on this thing? I got a solo I wrote for you, and it'd be amazing if you could come in and, you know, I'll buy you dinner next time we hang out if you're willing to make that trade. Like, if this is someone where, especially if you're at equal places in your career, assuming that's not like the principal bassoonist of the London Symphony that you're talking to, but it's like your friend who's also young and also getting started and excited at the prospect of having an excuse to just make more music all the time, they're probably going to say yes. They're, of course, not obligated to. And I certainly would never advocate trying to find people who would be willing to play for free, like as in non-monetary gain, because the whole point of what I'm saying is early on, monetary gain may be less of a priority for both of you. Because you realize, I just need experience. I just need a credit, or I just need it's not even for anything. I just wrote a piece for bassoon, and I just want to learn how to use this mic. Are you willing to come in and just play it a few times, read through it, and then give me feedback on it, and then we'll hang out and I'll buy you a beer or whatever. Like, there's so much human interaction 101 kind of basics to this stuff that don't require professional strategy or kind of almost like a scheming cleverness to figure out how to do. Just be a human that people want to hang out with, and find other people that you want to hang out with. And some of those people will be musicians, and maybe you can find ways to support each other. And then eventually, hopefully, you know, like if you're a composer, you can make sure every time they hire you, go, my buddy, you know, I'm always going to make sure to set aside, you know, however much percent or whatever makes sense, because I want to work with them. You know, like, for example, I have a woodwind player in Florida named Kristen, who I work with on virtually every project. And on every project, I just go in assuming I'm going to want to write for her, because she plays like well over 100 instruments of every wind instrument that you can fathom. She's principally an oboe player, and she's got one of the most gorgeous oboe tones I've ever heard. And it makes me motivated to write for oboe just because I love hearing her play. So I go in knowing that some of this budget just has to be for her. I just can't imagine. It's very rare that I don't really see a place for her in a score. I look for excuses. We just are working on a project right now where I said to her, we started talking about pan flutes, and the kind of big granddaddy bass version of the pan flutes is called the Toyo. And I said, you play Toyo? She's like, no, they're pretty rare. I don't even own one. And I said, well, how do you get one? She said, well, there's this one guy I remember seeing online where you have to pay him to build you one. And so it takes like a few months to get it in the mail because he's literally crafting this by hand. And I said, well, I got this project coming in a few months. So, you know, send me the invoice. I'm going to commission this instrument for you because we're going to want to use this in a little while. And so she's like, all right. So she's sending me email updates periodically, like, hey, he told me he's halfway through it, and hey, look what just came in the mail, you know. And I was like, oh, fire up the mic, let's hear it. So she's sending like, okay, I'm trying to make sound on this thing as she figures out how to play it. And then, of course, very quickly, she sounds great. I'm like, okay, let's get to work. You know, so that's one of those where over time we've built it up where, you know, that's just the nature of the instrument. Now I'm like, literally, I'm buying instruments for her collection just so we have an excuse for her to use it, because I don't need oboe on this score, but I could use some Toyo. And so let's get you a Toyo, you know? And so like, to me, there's a whole massive world of this kind of stuff that can lead to eventually got a situation where I can pull the trigger and hire, you know, maybe it's just a single cue, you know, you figure out a way to hire an orchestra for just an hour. You know, there's a few orchestras, particularly in Eastern Europe, where they'll have an extra hour, and if you're on their mailing list, they'll put out an email that says, hey, one of our clients isn't going to need their full time. So normally you can't book an orchestra for only an hour, because to make it worthwhile for the orchestral musicians, it has to be usually a 2 or 3 hour minimum time, or even a day rate, that kind of thing. Well, if somebody says, look, I only have 20 minutes of music, I don't need a full 4 hours, they'll resell. And, it works for everybody, because then that client is told, okay, you just pay for 2 hours, we'll resell the other time. And they go and they look for composers that maybe only need an hour, because it's just a single piece. Because it's like, say it's a mobile game that has only one piece of music, and it's just the home screen when you fire up the app. So they're like, oh yeah, I want to record this and build my portfolio. So yeah, I'll put the whole budget into just hiring the orchestra for 1 hour and do it. It's like, there you go. You're already, even if it's tiny, even if it's 15 musicians or 20 musicians, that's like a small orchestra, basically, all the way up through to obviously 100-piece orchestras and choirs and all kinds of crazy overdubs. And so I think it's a false dichotomy to perceive it as an either or. And by the way, you look at a score like the Pathless, we recorded all kinds of orchestral subset ensembles. There's a big French horn ensemble, there's a percussion ensemble, but I also did a lot of percussion overdubs separately. And that woodwind player I'm talking about, Kristen, she's featured all over the score in a half a dozen different instruments. So even when you're recording orchestra, I'm still working with my friends, recording them in their home studios, remote, or they come over here and track in my studio, that kind of thing. Everything ends up being a blend of everything at your disposal.
Thank you, Austin. That's very helpful.
Basically, the summary is there's nothing stopping you from just trying. There is a whole musicians community, especially on Facebook, where you just go on and say, are there any violinists that are willing to, record on this thing who, can help me out? I don't have a huge budget, but maybe you're willing to work with me. And there might be a violinist who's really good and says, I like the idea of helping young composers. So I'll work, if it's your first time ever hiring a violinist before, I'll give you a massive discount just to kind of help you get your feet wet. And the next time, hopefully he'll come back to me and be able to pay me my full rate. I know a million musicians who intentionally look for younger composers that haven't gotten started yet, because it builds a relationship for them. It gives them hopefully a pipeline for their own future work, and they're paving the way for their own long-term income, and they're helping another composer build their career in the process. It's extremely win-win. No, a million musicians like that, including musicians that are like rock stars that, they're like, hey, I just came off of a John Williams recording, but I'd like to help you out. Like real deal, top flight studio musicians.
So what's the best way our audience can get in touch with you?
Well, you very graciously mentioned my YouTube channel already. And then I'm on all the things. I don't really use Facebook anymore. But I'm very active on Twitter, and I am increasingly active on Instagram, and always happy to hear from folks.
I really want to acknowledge you for offering yourself as a guide to composers like me. And it really helps us out that you come to speak with us in these interviews. So thank you, Austin.
Well, it's my pleasure. It wasn't that long ago that I was in the exact same boat. And I honestly, most days I feel probably exactly the same way that you feel. I recognize that I've had some very lucky opportunities in my career, and I've had some things go very, very well, and had, worked on projects that people actually took notice of and helped it so people knew my work beyond, my mom. But I don't ever take that for granted. And I certainly remember very much the composers who helped me and were very giving of their time. And so I want everyone in the composer community, whether it's a colleague of mine or even somebody who, like I was just yesterday emailing with Marty O'Donnell. He actually emailed me to ask questions. And here's a person who's been in the business quite a few years before he's a couple of decades older than I am. But he treats me like a peer and a colleague, and I think of him the same way, even though I also have quite a lot of respect beyond. It feels like a stretch to call him a colleague because he's been in this business since I was a kid. But he reaches out to ask me questions, on Pathless, what is that instrument? How'd you find out about that? This, that. He asked me, and I'll do the same. He did a wonderful game called Gollum, came out last year or the year before, that I remember doing the same, emailing him and saying, I got a question about this, and tell me a little bit about this. And so it's like, whether it's peers of mine that I like to avail myself to, and there are some that do the same in response, like he and a bunch of others. I so too consider it a very important part of my day-to-day life to avail myself to anybody just getting started, especially because I remember how it feels to feel very lost and feel like I'm staring at an impossibly tall wall, and my goal is to somehow figure out how to climb over this. And I have no idea where to even begin. And I know that feeling. I remember that feeling very well. And I like to make sure folks know that, there are some of us who are, the perception is that it's all about climbing up and over the wall, and on the other side is like the promised land of career success. And in reality, it's more like an infinitely tall wall that we're all climbing. And so I like to, wherever I'm on that wall, kind of periodically latch in and put a hand down and say, let me try and give you something to stand on here and give you a boost, even if it's just making you aware of some BST you didn't know about, or hey, here's a little mixing trick that I picked up along the way, or here's like kind of the answers to the questions that you've been asking. So it really, in other words, my response to your comment is, it really is my pleasure. I consider it almost a moral duty, because I don't think any of us achieve anything that we do in a vacuum. We're all existing in this continuum with one another, and finding ways to bolster each other only helps the art form. And I think we're all here because we love this art form. It's not that I'm here because I want the world to, worship my music. It's that I love music, and I love games, and I love movies, and I love symphonies and chamber music. And I love a lot of things that fit under that banner. And if I can contribute my own little part to try to make it a better art form, and so too are my colleagues, then the extent that we help each other, we're actually lifting the art itself. And since that's the thing that I love above all, that's where my allegiance really falls. And all of this comes out as an extension of that.
Well, thank you, Austin, for taking your time with me.
No, it's my pleasure. And I'm very grateful for your analysis of my piece from Pathless. It was very interesting to see how you approached it. You did some things very similarly to how I did them, and then you did some things very differently to how I did them. And it was very cool to see what you picked up on. But broadly speaking, your analysis was very astute. And I'm very touched that you would use my work as a subject of one of your videos.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Take care.